January 30th, Lesson 6, Playing God, Sabbath afternoon. Read for this week's study Isaiah 13, 2 through 22, Isaiah 14, Isaiah 24 through 27. Memory text. Behold, this is our God. We have waited for him, and he will save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. We will be glad and rejoice in his salvation. Isaiah 25, verse 9. After a minister had preached a searching sermon on pride, a woman who had heard the sermon waited for him and told him that she was in much distress of mind and that she would like to confess a great sin. The minister asked her, what was the sin? She answered, the sin of pride. For I sat for an hour before my mirror some days ago admiring my beauty. Oh, responded the minister, that was not a sin of pride. That was a sin of imagination. That's C.E. McCartney. Ever since sin was born in the heart of a mighty angel, pride has not respected the boundaries of reality in angels or people. Nowhere is this problem seen worse than in those who harbor spiritual pride, a rather sorry trait in being so corrupted that their salvation can be found only in the works of another in their behalf. This week, among other things, we'll take a look at the origin of pride and self exaltation. Sunday, Doom on the Nations, Isaiah 13. Isaiah 13:1 has a heading that names Isaiah as the author. It seems also to begin a new section of his book. Chapters 13 through 23 contain oracles of judgment against various nations. Let's take a look. Why do prophecies against the nations begin with Babylon? Isaiah chapter 10, 5 through 34 had already announced judgment against Assyria, which posed the greatest danger in Isaiah's day, while Isaiah chapter 14, verses 24 through 27, briefly reiterates the Lord's plan to break Assyria. Chapters 13 through 23 deal mainly with other threats, Babylon being the most important. Endowed with a rich and ancient cultural, religious, and political legacy, Babylon later emerged as the superpower that conquered and exiled Judah. But from the human perspective of Isaiah's time, it would not have been readily apparent that Babylon would threaten God's people. During much of Isaiah's ministry, Assyria dominated Babylon. From 728 BC, when Tiglath-Pileser III took Babylon and was proclaimed king of Babylon under the throne of Pulu. See Kings chapter 15, verse 19, and 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 26. Assyrian kings retook Babylon several times. 710 BC, 702 BC, 689 BC, and 648 BC. Babylon, however, eventually would become the great superpower in the region, the power that would destroy the Judea kingdom. Now read through Isaiah chapter 13. Notice how strong the language is. Why does a loving God do these things or allow these things to happen? Certainly some innocent people will suffer as well, wouldn't they? Isaiah chapter 13, verse 16. How do we understand this action by God? What should these texts and all the texts in the Bible that talk about God's anger and wrath against sin and evil tell us about the egregious nature of sin and evil? Isn't the mere fact that a God of love would respond this way enough evidence to show us just how bad sin is? We have to remember that this is Jesus speaking these warnings through Isaiah, the same Jesus who forgave, healed, pled with, and admonished sinners to repent. In your own mind, how have you come to understand this aspect of a loving God's character? Ask yourself this question as well. Could not this wrath actually stem from his love? If so, how so? Or look at it from another perspective, that of the cross, where Jesus himself, bearing the sins of the world, suffered worse than anyone else ever has suffered, even those innocents who suffered because of the sins of the nation. How does the suffering of Christ on the cross help answer these difficult questions? Monday, February 1st. The late great city of Babylon, Isaiah chapter 32, verses 2 through 22. In 626 BC, the Chaldean Nebuchadnezzar restored Babylon glory by making himself king in Babylon, beginning the Neo-Babylonian dynasty and participating with Media in the defeat of Assyria. His son Nebuchadnezzar II was king who conquered and exiled Judah. How did the city of Babylon finally end? See Daniel chapter 5. In 539 BC, when Cyrus the Persian captured Babylon for the Medo-Persian Empire, see Daniel chapter 5, the city lost its independence forever. In 482 BC, Xerxes I brutally suppressed the revolt of Babylon against Persian rule. He removed the statue of Marduk, the chief god, and apparently damaged some fortifications and temples. Alexander the Great took Babylon from the Persians in 331 BC without a fight. In spite of his short-lived dreams to make Babylon his eastern capital, the city declined over several centuries. By 198 AD, the Roman Septimus Severus found Babylon completely deserted. So the great city came to an end through abandonment. Today, some Iraqi villagers live on parts of the ancient site, but they have not rebuilt the city as such. The doom of Babylon described in Isaiah 13 liberates the descendants of Jacob who have been oppressed by Babylon, Isaiah chapter 14, verses 4 through 6. The event that accomplished this was the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus in 539 BC. Although he did not destroy the city, this was the beginning of the end for Babylon, and it never threatened God's people again. Isaiah chapter 13 dramatizes the fall of Babylon and as a divine judgment. The warriors who take the city are God's agents. That's Isaiah chapter 13, 2 through 5. The time of judgment is called the day of the Lord. Isaiah chapter 13, verses 6 and 9. And God's anger is so powerful, it affects the stars, sun, moon, heavens, and earth. And that's Isaiah chapter 13, verses 10 and 13. Compare Judges chapter 5, where the song of Deborah and Barak describes the Lord as going forth with quaking of the earth and with rain from the heavens. Judges chapter 5, verse 4, Judges chapter 5, verse 20 and 21 depict the elements of nature, including stars, as fighting against the foreign oppressor. Imagine that someone living in Babylon at the height of its glory might read these words of Isaiah chapter 13, particularly Isaiah chapter 13, verses 19 through 22. How foolish and impossible they would have seemed. What other prophecies yet unfulfilled seem foolish and impossible to us now? Why would we be foolish, however, to dismiss them as impossible? Tuesday, February 2nd. Fall of the Mountain King, Isaiah chapter 14. In response to the fall of Babylon, Isaiah chapter 13, which frees God's people, Isaiah chapter 14, 1 through 3, and Isaiah chapter 14, 4 through 23, utters a figurative taunt against the king of Babylon. It is poetic, not meant to be literal, obviously, as it portrays dead kings greeting their new colleague in the realm of death. And that's Isaiah chapter 14, verses 9 and 10, where maggots and worms are his bedding. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 11. This is simply the Lord's dramatic way of telling the haughty king that he shall be brought low as other proud monarchs before him. It is not a commentary on the state of the dead. How could Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 14 apply to a king of Babylon? Babylonian kings did not suffer from the lack of self-esteem, Daniel chapter 4 and chapter 5, but aspiring to be like the Most High, Isaiah chapter 14, verse 14, would be beyond even the most inflated ego. While kings claimed strong connections with the gods, they were subservient to them. This was dramatically demonstrated every year on the 5th day of the Babylonian New Year festival, in which the king was required to remove his royal insignia before approaching the statue of Marduk so his kingship could be reaffirmed. The idea of displacing even a lesser god would have been looked upon as crazy and suicidal. As in Isaiah chapter 14, Ezekiel chapter 28 identifies heaven daring arrogance with the ruler of a city. Here also the description goes beyond that of an earthly monarch, and God's crosshairs come into sharper focus. The proud potentate was in the Garden of Eden, an anointed covering or guardian cherub on God's holy mountain, perfect from the day he was created until sin was found in him, cast out by God, and who will eventually be destroyed with fire. Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 through 18. Applied to any human being, the specific terms of this rhetoric are so figurative as to be meaningless. But Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through 9 does tell of a mighty being who was cast out of heaven with his angels. Satan, the deceiver of the world. Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, who deceived Eve in Eden. Satan has a proud imagination. You have said, I am a God. I sit in the seat of gods, in the heart of the seas. Yet you are but a mortal and no God. Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 2. His death will prove he is no God. Unlike Christ, Satan will perish in the heart of a sea of fire. Revelation chapter 20, verse 10, never to haunt the universe again. Compare Isaiah chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, with Matthew chapter 11, verse 29, John chapter 13, verse 5, and Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. What does this contrast tell us about the character of God as opposed to the character of Satan? What does this contrast tell us about how the Lord views pride, arrogance, and the desire for self-supremacy? Wednesday, February 3rd. Heaven's Gate, Isaiah chapter 13 and 14. In Isaiah 14, a taunt against Satan, the fallen day star, Lucifer, son of dawn, is blended into a taunt against the king of Babylon. Why? Compare Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, where a dragon identified as Satan in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, tries to destroy a child as soon as it is born. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 5, the child is clearly Christ. But it was King Herod who tried to kill Jesus as a young child, Matthew chapter 2. The dragon is both Satan and the Roman power represented by Herod, because Satan works through human agents. Similarly, Satan was the power behind the king of Babylon and the prince of Tyre. Why does Babylon later refer to Rome in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, and to an evil power in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 14, verse 8, chapter 16, verse 19, Revelation chapter 17, verse 5, Revelation chapter 18, verse 2, 10, and 21. Like literal Babylon, Rome and the Babylon of Revelation are proud, ruthless powers that oppress God's people. See especially Revelation chapter 17, verse 6, for it is drunk with the blood of the saints. They rebel against God, an idea implied in the name Babylon itself. In the Babylonian language, the name is Bab-ili, which means the gate of gods, referring to the place of access to the divine realm. Compare Genesis chapter 11, where people built the Tower of Babel, Babylon, so that by their own power they could rise to the divine level of immunity from any accountability to God. When Jacob awoke from a dream in which he saw a ladder connecting heaven and earth, he exclaimed, "There is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." Genesis chapter 28, verse 17. Notice that the house of God is the gate of heaven. That is the way of access to the divine realm. Jacob named the place Bethel, which means house of God. The gate of heaven at Bethel and the gate of gods at Babylon were opposite ways to reach the divine realm. Jacob's ladder originated in heaven, revealed from above by God. But Babylon, with its towers and ziggurat temples, was built by human beings from the ground up. The opposite way represents contrasting paths to salvation, divinely initiated grace versus human works. All true religion is based on the humble Bethel model. For by grace you have been saved through faith. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. All false religion, including legalism and secular humanism, is based on the proud Babylon model. For the contrast between the two approaches, See Jesus' parable of the Pharisee and the publican, Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Even after spending a few years in a Zen monastery, Canadian songwriter Leonard Cohen told an interviewer, "I'm not saved." In the context of today's study, what do you think his problem was? What did he need to know about salvation? Thursday, February 4. Final triumph of Zion, Isaiah chapters 24 through 27. Following oracles against individual nations in Isaiah chapters 13 through 23 and Isaiah chapters 24 through 27 describes on a worldwide scale the climatic defeat of God's enemies and the deliverance of his people. Why does Isaiah's description of the desolation of the earth, Isaiah chapter 24, look like John's description in the events connected with 1,000 years that follow Christ's second coming, Revelation chapter 20? As in Isaiah chapters 13 through 14, aspects of literal Babylon apply to later powers, and the king of Babylon represents fusion of human rulers with the mastermind behind them, Satan himself. So, a message that Babylon is fallen, Isaiah chapter 21, verse 9, can be repeated at a later time, Revelation chapter 14, verse 8, Revelation chapter 18, verse 2, and Satan is finally destroyed after Christ's second coming, Revelation chapter 20, verse 10. While the destruction of literal Babylon was a judgment, day of the Lord, Isaiah chapter 13, verses 6 and 9, another great and terrible day of the Lord, Joel chapter 2, verse 31, Malachi chapter 4, verse 5, compare, is on the way. Similarly, in Isaiah chapter 24, the prophet's vision reaches through conditions with which he is familiar to the time when the moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, Isaiah chapter 24, verse 23. Isaiah undoubtedly thought the vision applied to the Jerusalem he knew, but the book of Revelation explains that it will actually be fulfilled in the New Jerusalem, Revelation chapter 21, verse 2. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God is its light. Its lamp is the Lamb, Revelation chapter 21, verse 23. Does God really destroy the wicked? Look at Isaiah chapter 28, verse 21. Where's God's work of destruction is his strange deed. It is strange for him because he doesn't want to do it, but it is nevertheless a deed or an act. It is true that sin carries the seeds of self-destruction, James chapter 1, verse 15. But because God has ultimate power over life and death, and he determines the time, place, and manner of final destruction, Revelation chapter 20, it is pointless to argue that he ultimately terminates the curse of sin in a passive way by simply allowing cause and effect to take its natural course. What we see in Isaiah chapter 24 through 27 is what we see reflected in the entire Bible, which is that no matter the suffering, pain, and desolation now, in the end, God and goodness will triumph over evil. What then is the only thing we can do if we ourselves want to be part of that final victory? Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 7, Romans chapter 10, verse 9. Friday, February 5th. Further study. It is by conditions that we receive salvation, never by conditions that we come to Christ. And if we come to Christ, then what is the condition? The condition is that by living faith, we lay hold wholly and entirely upon the merits of the blood of a crucified and risen Savior. When we do that, then we work the works of righteousness. But when God is calling the sinner in our world and inviting him, there is no condition there. He draws by the invitation of Christ, and it is not now that you have to go to respond in order to come to God. The sinner comes, and as he comes and views Christ elevated upon that cross of Calvary, which God impresses upon his mind, there is a love beyond anything that is imagined that he has taken hold of. Ellen G. Wright Manuscripts. Discussion questions. Look at the above quote from Ellen G. Wright. Read it in the context of Wednesday's study. What is she telling us there? Notice in her statement both elements of the Christian walk, faith, and then works. How does she differentiate between them? Number two, why are pride and arrogance such dangerous sins? Why are they so hard to put away? Can it be because their very nature, they blind people to their need to put them away? After all, if you're proud, you think you are okay. And if you think you are okay, why bother changing? How can dwelling on the cross and what it represents, the only means of saving any person, be a powerful cure for pride and arrogance in anyone? Does Isaiah see hope for people in other nations? See, for example, Isaiah chapter 25, verses 3 and 6, and Isaiah chapter 26, verse 9. Also compare Revelation chapter 19, verse 9. In summary, Isaiah saw that following Assyria, Babylon would conquer Judah. But he also saw that in spite of superhuman rulers of the darkness of this world, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, working through God's human enemies and presuming to play God, the Lord would decisively prevail and bring eternal peace to our troubled planet.